Hey y'all, hey everybody, it's Mo here. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Let's get right into today's video. The world was shocked when Meghan Markle revealed how she was treated by the royal family. But would you be shocked if you knew that a large portion of that family's wealth came from slavery? That at the height of the slave trade, the Royal African Company held a monopoly on transatlantic slave trade. Today, I want to talk a little bit about how modern racism is the lasting legacy of the British Empire and colonialism. If I bring up something you may not have heard before, please look it up and learn about it. My goal in this video is not to give you all the facts, but to encourage you to look deeper. Google is your friend. We can draw a direct line from the Catholic Church through the royal families of Europe to slavery and modern capitalism that still today upholds the land-owning white male as a class superior to all others. I'm going to point you to a video by Mark Charles where he gives one such example using a 2005 decision by the United States Supreme Court to demonstrate the impact of history and the reality of modern-day white supremacy. Let's talk about colonialism. Before I start to break it down for you, I want you to think about what comes to your mind when you think about colonialism. Probably white people in quaint outfits. But at its heart, colonialism is violent and dehumanizing. I say is and not was because colonialism lingers in society today, but we will get to that. In the past, we had three groups holding power over society: the landed nobility, the warriors, and the church. The landowner had the most power because they controlled the means of production, the land. The warriors were second because they brought glory to the landowners by fighting, and also they helped them acquire more land and maintain control. The church was third because they were supported by the landowners and controlled every aspect of life. So basically, what we have is a system where if you own the land, you have power and everyone is under your control. You can treat people how you want because everything is yours. Eventually, the church became so powerful that they had more power than the nobility. So we ended up with the divine right to rule and the British monarch being the head of the Church of England and all that stuff that happened. Going off this, the structure was the more land you own, the more resources you control, the more power you have. The European nations were in a race to own everything, emboldened by the church because if you keep your people poor, you keep them dependent on you. All of this is fueled by a sense of moral superiority and entitlement. I have all the things because I am better than all the other people. Having all the things makes me better than other people. I should have all the things. That's the mentality we're dealing with. We see landed nobility fencing off entire forests and telling people you can't hunt there anymore, claiming lands and taxing the occupants. The nobility claimed that it was their divine obligation to exert power and to grow their wealth, but we can see that it was their desperation to claim power and wealth and to ensure that this power and wealth would be safe for future generations of their family. Europeans love foreign things: spices, cloth, dyes, gold, ivory. For that, you need merchants. The merchants are traveling to faraway places and making so much money that they now have big fancy houses and fancy clothes. So the landed nobility and the church don't have as much power over the people because they're not controlling the wealth, and they need to fix that. The easiest way to fix that is for them to own the foreign things. So the various kings, queens, and popes start sponsoring explorations. What they need to do is they need to go over there and take the land and resources. Small problem, there are already people there. These people are not as quick to acquiesce to the rulers. Fighting them can take a while. Now, when you set up yourself as basically being God on earth, there's only so much killing you can do before people get turned off. Plus, you're going to need workers, which leads us to the most damaging times in colonization. You might have been taught that colonization is one country sending settlers to a new country and claiming that new country for themselves. You might think it's like buying a second house, but there is more to it. It's like finding a house, killing some of the occupants, telling the remaining occupants that everything about them is wrong, forcing them to act like you and never accepting them as part of the household. Have you ever heard the term "the sun does not set on the British Empire"? No one was quite as successful at colonization as the British. At the height of colonization, they claimed land in just about every time zone. They would show up and say, "India is mine now." Turtle Island? You mean North America? It's mine now. They needed a way to claim all this land and maintain moral superiority, so the church and nobility simply classified all indigenous people as savages and put systems in place to prevent them and their descendants from attaining positions of power. That is why in 2005, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was able to use a hundreds of years old doctrine to rule against indigenous people. The system is working exactly as it was supposed to. It was created to uphold the power of white male landowners, and that is what it continues to do. If step 1 was to dehumanize indigenous people, step 2 was to perpetuate the myth that proximity to whiteness would increase proximity to power and acceptance by the white elite. This is how we end up with colorism, the myth of a meritocracy, and upward mobility. Before I get too far ahead, let's talk about the Royal Africa Company. So we have King Charles, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland at the time. Now you need money to maintain power, and a good place to get money is by mining gold in Africa. So the royal family set up the Royal African Company. They or their friends own the mines, they own the ports, they make laws about who can own ships and who can trade in the ports, and essentially create a monopoly with themselves as sole suppliers of those foreign things we talked about. Then they realize that trading people is even more profitable than trading gold, precious minerals, and spices. They really lean into their "we are human and you are not" philosophy. Would we have 400 years of chattel slavery without the British monarchy? I don't know, and I don't care to engage in what ifs when we have a society that refuses to acknowledge history and how the landed nobility created a system whose only purpose was to further enrich themselves and their descendants. Let's talk a little more about that system and why it continues to this day. Colonialism was built on the system of white supremacy. And once white supremacy was legitimized and codified, it became part of the collective psyche and almost impossible to uproot. Publication after publication were written and popularized on the inferiority of, basically every not white male. They used religion and science. The church was more than happy to create and spread propaganda because, they own slaves and land in the New World. You can see how all of this was in their best interest. The church was all too happy to preach that it was the white man's responsibility to exert power over everyone else and reframe their greed as a virtue. This reframing of history, their acts, their intentions, that is directly responsible for a lot of the racial conflict today. You see, when I went to school here in St. Lucia, I learned that slaves were sold in markets with livestock. They were often seen as lower than horses. That is why I remain sensitive to white people treating animals better than black people. That's not new. I could not find the exact flyer that I saw as a child that listed prices, and the horses cost more than the black person. But I remember my teacher explaining that slaves were only valued for their labor and their ability to produce more laborers. I remember seeing drawings depicting the cramped conditions of slaves shackled on ships and learning that slaves sat in their own excrement and many died on the journey over. I was taught that sometimes at the height of the slave trade, slaves were packed in so tight they could not even lay down. All of this I learned before I was 10 years old as the history of my people, my country, my history. Now, I don't know how this was being taught in the UK, but somehow you have people growing up and not knowing about the realities of slavery. We are not even going to talk about what is being taught in America. Now let's skip ahead a few years. Here I am knowing the horrors of slavery, but one question remains in my mind. Why do white people get so upset at the very mention of slavery? They get upset at other things, but I dare you to mention slavery and watch white people get upset. If you're lucky, they will even cry. One of the main reasons is because of how they were taught about slavery. So, facing the conflicting reality, they have trouble rationalizing their own individual history. I think it's because their entire belief system is built on white supremacy. And when they realize that their ancestors were not the good men with good intentions that they were taught, they are forced to face who they are as a person. I began to understand this in 2015 when I learned that the British government paid £20 million to slave owners for the loss of property when they abolished slavery, and nothing in wages to former slave. Documents showing these payments revealed just how many upstanding British citizens actually owned slaves. It was not just the landed nobility. By the time slavery was abolished in 1834, many average middle class citizens owned shares in slaves. Y'all, you could own shares in a company that owns slaves. Until these documents were exposed, many British people saw slavery as an American problem. It was a thing that happened in the Caribbean. They were taught to be proud of abolitionists like William Wilberforce, while the darker, more pervasive history of British slavery was concealed. They were not taught how ordinary British people benefited from slavery or how it created myths that last to this day and continue to shape global racial inequity. Without that knowledge of the history, it's no wonder white supremacy continues to be a major player in UK politics. So many people are desperately holding on to white supremacy and they don't even know it. Don't believe me? I have a simple activity for you. Watch how the dynamic changes when a white man enters the room. Before I understood how white supremacy governs society, I didn't understand why this happened. If there is no white man in the room, a conversation continues. When a white man enters, many people, especially white women, will defer to the white man. It does not matter if he is right. They will know he is wrong and they will agree with him. Now that you've seen it, you won't be able to unsee it. How many people were screaming that Meghan Markle was on the receiving end of racism from the British press and the royal family, but they were being gaslit and called all sorts of names. As soon as Harry said, well, someone asked how dark the baby was going to be, everyone was screaming and pointing, racism, racism. The whole situation also clearly demonstrates that proximity to whiteness might benefit minorities, but at the end of the day, it still won't make you accepted as equals. That is a whole other topic that I will tackle in another video. For now, I want you to think about how white supremacy affects everyday life, from systemic racism to who you see as beautiful and intelligent. So much of modern life is shaped by racist ideologies, while at the same time denying their origins. That discomfort you feel, that's cognitive dissonance. How can you believe that corners and locks are unprofessional without acknowledging that you think that black hair is ugly? How can you be team turf without acknowledging that you see women as only having value based on their reproductive ability? How can you say black people are lazy without acknowledging that you feel entitled to black labor? How can you say you don't want Mexicans, Muslims, etc. in your spaces without acknowledging that you see them as inferior and not quite human? In his video, Mark Charles proposes that healing cannot begin until we have a shared history. He explains that white people continue to be taught a history of expansionism and exceptionalism that goes directly against the lived reality of black and brown people. I think that might be where we start. But there's a lot of work we have to do to decolonize our minds, our institutions, and everyday life. We need to teach folks not only how these systems were created, but how they continue to affect them. For too long, the burden has been on the oppressed. We have to point out the oppression, explain the oppression, fight to end the oppression, figure out how to replace the systems of oppression. All of this while being oppressed and trying to survive in a system that was not built for us. Those who have benefited from the system need to start doing more. That wealth you have because your parents could own land, spread it around. Look inside at how your thoughts and actions are shaped by white supremacy and make a conscious effort to change it. Most importantly, use your social and political capital to change the system of oppression. We could talk about these topics for years and never run out of things to talk about, but this is where we will end today. If you'd like to say thank you to me, my PayPal is down below. No, I do not have Cash App or Venmo because rich people hide their money, and the only consequence is that banking becomes harder for poor people. Support me on a regular basis by joining my Patreon and joining this channel as a member. Like this video and share it with your friends. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you'll have a good day. Bye.